So today, as the clickbait thumbnail would suggest, I'm trying to get some guitars to sit in the mix without any post EQ on them. Um, Whether or not I'm completely lying, I'll let you be the judge of it. I've done a little bit of low and high pass filtering, so that's just removing sub low end and just some ultra high end, but not touching any EQ other than EQ on the amp. I really wanted to see if I could get a good guitar tone just with one of my impulse responses, using a plugin and just dialing in the EQ for the mix just using the amp. And this is something that's pretty dependent on the impulse response or the cab or the mic placement that you've got going on. That's going to be the main thing that's going to shape the guitar tone and see how well it sits in the mix. You'll find that some guitar cabinets or speakers will be just too boxy sounding, just as they are, just flat. And sometimes you'll find maybe that the closer you go to try and get a bit more brightness, they're just too fizzy and the high end's a bit unpleasing. So sometimes you just luck out with a really great impulse response or mic placement or speaker on a cab that just sounds really good without any post EQ. You may have seen in some videos I've done recently that I've been quite heavy-handed with some EQ moves, especially if I'm doing like a tone recreation where I'm trying to recreate an album tone of, a tone where I don't have that exact speaker they've used. So when I was dialing in the tone for this, I was just cycling through various impulse responses from my impulse response pack, trying to find a tone that just sounded really good sitting in the mix. And I normally prefer top speakers in cabinets, especially on an angled cabinet. You can get the mic to sort of replicate that angle that the slant is on, and it gets even closer than the mic does on the bottom speakers, and you get more of a direct sound the closer you can get to the speaker, I find. So I prefer that, but I ended up going to the bottom right speaker in one of my cabs, which is the exact speaker I used on the Cycle of Suffering record. And it's surprisingly just a great sounding speaker. It's from 2005, and it doesn't have too much kind of boxiness that you get typically in like bottom speakers in cabinets, and it just sounded really good as is. So I'm going to show you how I've dialed that in just using EQ on the amp plugin as opposed to post EQ. I do have pre-EQ'd impulse responses in my impulse response pack that definitely sound just mix ready to go without post EQ, but I wanted to try and do it for the first time on here without any EQ on the impulse response. So the impulse response is flat. It's exactly how the mic sounded in front of the cabinet. And like I said, the only EQ I'm doing is on the guitar amp, on the plugin, and low and high pass filtering, but that doesn't count. Or does it? I don't know. And before we get into it, just want to say a huge thank you to my Patreon community for all the support. And if you're not a member, please consider signing up. And anytime I do videos like this, I'll try and upload the stems and the files for you to check out for the highest tier patrons. Right, so I'm gonna isolate a bit of guitar here, and one of these main guitars which I've panned. Is that not the main guitar? That's the main guitar there. Usually I have them the other way around. I will move them now. The louder one's on top. So it's hard pan. I'm just going to put it in mono now, and we can check out what's going on the channel. So I've decided to use STL Ignite with their 6505. I've used STL Libra to load the impulse response. It's just this one that we're using here. So this is cab 2 bottom right, and that's a 57 mic, and it's in position 2, which is a little bit brighter than I normally go. And there's an EQ here, and this was just for me to sort of look at what the tone looked like. So as you can see, there's nothing going on here. Now all the guitars are being sent to a guitar group where there is some multiband compression, which we'll get to, and I can take that off to show you how it sounds without that on it. And this is the EQ, where I would say it doesn't really count as EQing guitars. To me, that's more of like a safety precaution of like getting rid of sub low end that you just don't need for guitars in a mix. So we can turn that on and off, but in terms of getting into, you know, like boosting high end and cutting mids and all that stuff, these guitars have been left flat. So let's check out the guitar tone. So those are the settings. Got an OD808. This is kind of typical for me. I could probably go even brighter still, maybe on the high end in the presence, but I'm just going to leave it because that's kind of how I got it sounding in the mix. And I've got some secondary guitar tracks with a different amp. So let's see. That'll be this one. And in this instance, STL Ignite again, but I've used their dual rec. With those settings, modern mode, and the OD808. So I'm going to put these back to where they were, and we're going to listen to the entire group, the guitar group as is. And listen to them in the mix. Now I haven't got the master bus processing on this, which you heard the full version at the start of this video. So let's loop a bit of the riff. We're going to take off all of the processing, so that's the multi-band compressor. So if you haven't seen any of my videos on guitar tones, this is something that I do, that a lot of people do on heavy guitars, and this is just compressing just this area, so between 64 and 258, and it only really comes into play on palm mutes where the chugging just makes the low end or the low mids kind of bloom, and this just controls those bits of the riff. And this is with it off. It's pretty subtle. You'll probably notice it more, the difference that you're hearing it with it on and off on like a decent set of speakers, as opposed to just hearing that in headphones. And then the EQ is off. So admittedly, we're killing a little bit of high end. You can hear that, but you can't really hear anything changing in the low end, really. And actually, I'm going to try moving this across a little bit more to let a bit more of that high end through. Cool. So that's how the guitars are sounding. It's important to just say that the impulse response is the same on these guitars, even though it's a different amp. Now there's definitely improvements that could be made on this guitar tone with some EQ, but it's definitely pretty close to what I would consider a finished mix ready guitar tone anyway. So there are just going to be things that we could look at to improve upon this tone with some EQ, but I'm pretty happy with how it sounds without any real EQ apart from the low and high pass filtering. So the main thing that I can hear that I would personally want to notch out is actually this kind of boxy whistle. Is it a whistle? I don't know. This kind of area. And just doing that has made the tone way more palatable for me, and that is even closer to just a fully finished sounding guitar tone. Now this area can get a little bit out of hand. Obviously the multi-band compression is tackling that area as well, but I'd also probably just kind of carve a little bit of it out. and maybe just boost a little bit more in this area. So not much going on there EQ wise, but the clip you heard at the start of this video was completely flat, or I say flat, it was like this. So it did have some low and high pass filtering, but no like real EQ moves or notching out any frequencies of any sort. So definitely worth, just before you get too hands on in going crazy EQ in your guitars, which I'm definitely guilty of doing. Sometimes it's worth just cycling through as many impulse responses as you can, trying to dial in the tone on the amp to get it to sit in the mix without any EQ. And the less EQ you can do in the mix, the better your guitars are going to sound, the less degradation of tone there will be. So definitely something to play around with. And like I said, I've got mix ready impulse responses in the impulse response pack that I've already pre-EQ'd to my sort of generic 5150 settings. That will work great, obviously, without any post EQ. Also, before I finish up the video, I'll let you guys know about the guitar tone on Cycle of Suffering. So at the time, I had a 5150 signature 5150 amp before I got the block letter. It actually started playing up during the recording or the reamping period of mixing the record, and it was unreliable or was just broken when it came to reamping the guitars. I'd been sent some amp DIs of Nolly's block letter 5150, and another friend of mine, James, who has a 5150, and the thing that we could identify that all our block letters, well, I didn't have mine at the time, but the block letters had was this kind of thicker low mids, which you could argue is actually just the muddier lower mid range, not necessarily like a better sound or anything. I think I had my 6505 plus at the time and maybe a 6505, but I didn't have my block letter, and I was trying to get dial in my sound as close as I could to Nolly. So I had an amp DI of his, so he had a Sir load box that he recorded his 5150 into. I also have one of those, so I could use the same impulse response and A/B the sound of his amp versus the sound of my amp in the same impulse response. And the closest I could get to that kind of more clouded lower mid range was actually using the green channel on my 6505 plus. So I used that channel. I had the gain pretty high because there's less gain on that channel. I feel like I had the mids close to being completely off, and I boosted it with a Maxon OD808, and it's still not overly saturated. It's not like a ton of gain on that tone. I'm still kind of proud of the sound. I definitely prefer the tone on the new record, but just for anyone who was interested, that was the thought process behind the sound on Cycle of Suffering, in terms of I was trying to emulate Nolly's block letter in terms of that kind of thicker lower mid range, and it's where kind of the notes kind of are a bit more clear, so in that kind of 300 to 400 area. But it doesn't, the green channel on the 6505 plus doesn't have the same kind of tightness in the in like the high end, so it's not quite as sharp sounding as I'd like. So that is a little bit about the guitar tone on Cycle of Suffering, and this speaker in particular, this bottom right speaker from 2005, was what was used on Cycle of Suffering, just a single SM57.